Hello, puppies and kittens. This is another Why Do You Believe series. This is one I like to talk to people that because I don't want to be an echo chamber. I want to talk to people that don't agree with me. And we pick different topics that people don't agree with me on. And in this case, there's a Hindu in New Zealand who said that I made a positive claim that religion is nonsense, and he wanted to challenge me on that. And I thought that would be a fun conversation. So, Arjuna Das, how you doing? And
yeah, good. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
It's all right. It's all right. So, as I understand, nonsense means that that it's foolish, that it's not, that's incoherent, and I think I'm completely justified in that we have thousands of different denominations just within Christianity. Christianity is just one of many religions. You're not even part of that religion, so everybody has a different opinion about who God is and what he will do and what he likes, what he hates, what he wants. And everybody's opinion is equally treated as if it's the absolute truth and all of that, even though nobody has the fact even that there is a God in the first place. So how do we know all these details about him?
So that's quite a common argument. It's, I guess it's an epistemic one. How do we know which one's true? And the argument
if any are true, that's the funny thing.
Well, I mean, I guess the argument is something like, because they all disagree, the chances are they're all wrong.
The fact that none of them are based on any, none of them can show that there's a there is sufficient for me.
Okay, so that means that the fact that lots of them disagree on lots of points becomes irrelevant. The question is whether there's good evidence for any of the claims.
No. The fact that they're all certain about their little refined points is still similar, because while they're all argument, how do we put this? I mean, like, most of the world is probably in the Marvel Comics universe, and yours is an older religion, so you're still in the DC universe. But just because yours is older doesn't mean that yours is right, or that either of you have anything to go on at all.
So, can you unpack that analogy? I haven't heard that before.
Comic books.
Yeah. So,
in the DC universe, you have Superman and Batman, and they live in Gotham City and Metropolis. These are fake cities. But in the Marvel Comics universe, Spider-Man lives in New York City, and all of the superheroes live in real places. So it has been argued that if the Bible, for example, mentions Ethiopia, and there's really an Ethiopia, that somehow that makes it evidence for the truth of God. But then, it kind of mentions New York City in Spider-Man comics too. So does that mean that Spider-Man comics is more valid than Superman?
Well, yeah, that wouldn't be evidence either way. I mean, a mythological story could contain facts that can be verified and still be mythological.
Yeah, so we have all these different opinions of every type of witchcraft and every kind of magic and faith healing, and every religion has all of these different claims, not just their mythology or whatever, but none of them can show that any of their details are correct. There's not one religion in the world that can show that they are more accurate than the others.
Well, I'll start with one point before we launch into it a bit further. So I've heard you say in some of your videos that everything religion teaches is wrong.
Yep.
So there's some things that religion teaches which are widely accepted as just basic.
Okay, so you're saying if religion teaches that we live on an earth and the sky is blue, and they teach that we should love our fellow man, the same thing that everybody teaches, then it's not exclusively what religion teaches. We're talking about where religion. I mean,
no. But when you say everything they teach is wrong, you're saying they're wrong when they teach that we should love each other.
Right. What does religion teach that is different than what everybody teaches? So religions teach that their various gods exist, or that their various mythologies have, their so on legends have happened, and all of this, and they give different rituals to perform different things. All of these are unique to religions. Now, they don't teach that, Columbus discovered America. They may agree that, on certain historical facts, they may, along with everybody else, but where they agree doesn't make that something that religion teaches.
Well, it is something they teach. It's just not something that's unique to them.
Okay.
Anyway, that's just splitting hairs, really. I
think it is. Yeah, we are talking about what religion teaches that is different than what everybody else teaches. And then we want to talk about what one religion teaches over another.
Right. Oh, I've actually got a list, it might take me a second to pull up, of things that all religions pretty much accept. Of course, you get outliers like Gnosticism and Manichaeanism, which are totally, outliers from the rest. But basically, you get all religions teaching things like there's a goal of human life, which is something beyond what's right in front of us now. They'll all teach that. None of them are disagreement about that. So they just have different conceptions of what that goal is like. But that's a detail. And they'll all agree that on slightly different epistemologies being valuable, that there's a such thing as revealed knowledge that can give us knowledge that we can't get from other means. So they're all in agreement on a few points such as those. So when you
this
say
is an important thing to bring up, if I may interject again. When I took a class on the history of comparative world religions, they told me that defining what a religion is would be a virtually impossible task. But because I do classification, I didn't find it to be impossible. I just found a commonality. What is it that they all have in common? And every religion, universally accepted as such, is a faith-based belief system that posits that some supernatural essence of self somehow survives the death of the physical body to continue on in some other form. That I found to be consistent with everybody.
Yeah. So if you want to make the claim, which some people make in response to Pascal's wager, that because they all disagree, chances are they're all wrong, that same logic applied to if the soul continues beyond the body, or if there is a soul or something that continues. Even Buddhism, they say there's no soul, but they still talk about karma and reincarnation. So they don't really mean that there's no soul. It's just an odd thing they say, which is inconsistent with what they actually believe.
Yeah, I gotta throw something in on that too. My wife and I were married in a Theravada Buddhist temple, and while she was talking to the people to secure the pavilion for the event and everything, I took a class. They were teaching Buddhism, and the guy told me that they don't believe in a soul, that they don't believe in God. That they don't believe in an afterlife. They don't believe that you were reborn. And then moments later, the same guy said that you maybe in spirit form for a while before you are reincarnated or find a new body to live in. And then he said that none of us have ever been born, so we can't be reborn. And I said, well, we all have birth certificates. And so there's a problem with the argument. And then he said that he doesn't believe in God, but he will pray to Buddha, and Buddha will answer prayers with miracles. That's okay. So Buddha is a magical anthropomorphic immortal who answers prayers with miracles. And you don't believe in a soul. You don't believe in any concept of self. But you used the word you when you said that you could be a ghost for a while before you live again. So you do believe that we're born again and there's an afterlife, and that the soul, that some essence of self continues on after the death of the physical being. And they never wanted to see me again.
That's pretty typical. I'm glad we can agree on that. So there's what they call the doctrine, the sermon given on the Mount by Buddha, and it's called the Sermon on the Non-Existence of the Soul. And scholars have noted that the sermon does not say anywhere in it that the soul does not exist. It's the teachings given by Buddha are negative teachings. So the absolute or the soul, it's not this, it's not that. Just like you could identify something by telling people what it's not. And that is useful for gaining some understanding into what it is. But it doesn't tell you that the soul doesn't exist.
Yeah, and he never even came out. He's been often labeled as an atheist, which is kind of funny that people worship him as a god. If Siddhartha Gautama was supposed to be an atheist in real life, but in fact, he never said that God doesn't exist. He said whether gods exist or not is irrelevant.
It's the Vedic literature is really interesting because it actually talks about other religions and gives some perspective on them. So the Srimad Bhagavatam explains several incarnations of Krishna, and one of them is listed as Buddha. That Buddha came as Buddha for a particular purpose, and he came for the purpose of bewildering the atheists. And at the time, people were taking the Vedic scriptures and misusing them. So there's like animal sacrifice. And so they were using this kind of sacrifice. The way it's supposed to be done in the Vedas is that the horse goes into the fire and comes out with a new body. So you haven't killed the horse. You've just shown that you're doing the rituals correctly.
Yeah,
and you've proven
I
it by
remember
doing.
reading. As a matter of fact, I've got that line you just mentioned. I got it quoted in one of my videos, where it talks about, where I think the translation into English that I read was that the incarnation of Krishna into Buddha was to delude the atheists. So
Yeah. So I'll just finish explaining the purpose that's given in the Krishna consciousness understanding, that the people were misunderstanding the scriptures and using it to justify violence and killing animals. So Lord Buddha came and said, just forget the Vedas, throw the whole thing out, just be compassionate. You're suffering. Here's how to stop suffering. You're banging your head against the wall. Stop banging your head against the wall and you'll stop suffering. So the teachings Buddha gave are really simple. And he threw the whole Vedas out, said, forget about that, just be compassionate and loving. And then later, Shankaracharya came and brought the Vedas in, and then Madhavacharya came and brought in the theistic understanding of the Vedas. And then there was a series of acharyas following from there. So it's a kind of, bring in the lesser of two evils and then gradually transfer over to another thing. So that's kind of a tangent, but
no, that's fine. I felt something of an affinity to Hinduism in my teen years, probably largely related to the artwork that was always associated. There was a series of famous paintings that you saw in like every Krishna temple that all looked like they were done by the same guy. It was like the same artistic style, and I quite liked that. And so I started reading Sri Prabhupada. What was the book? The Science of Self-Realization by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada.
That's a good book.
Yeah, well, not so much. My problem was that I wanted to know how things worked, and I was okay with believing in the soul. Everybody believes in the soul, and I was 16 years old when I read this, and then I want to know how reincarnation works. I want to know all of these things. And so I'm reading it from kind of that angle, and then when they start getting into what the various gods did and how they interacted with each other, I mean, it all just became Zeus and Hera, and I don't care about Thor and Loki and all of that crap. I want to know how things are and how they work. And so that's where the book lost all value for me.
All right.
Likewise, when I read the Bhagavad Gita, right at the very beginning, I can tell you that I read this with as open a mind as you can possibly have, because I wanted Krishna to be infinitely more wise than Jesus. Now, while everybody has been programmed in our culture, in our Western culture, to revere Jesus as if he is wise, I can't. Jesus said some stupid shit. And so I'm expecting Krishna is going to be more wise than Jesus. And in some respects, I mean, he's definitely better than Jesus in a lot of ways. But when I'm introduced to the character of Arjuna, your namesake, at the beginning of the book, I quite liked that guy. Right as the book began, I really liked Arjuna. And then Krishna showed up and shit on everything that was great about Arjuna. and turned him around. He was a great and noble person. And then Krishna says, no, forget your morality. Kill all your friends and family, because it doesn't matter. The reason that we're vegetarian is because we won't kill animals because they used to be people, but we can go ahead and kill people because they'll become animals.
Well, you need to know the backstory to that whole war in order to understand the situation.
I don't think there's any justification for that. Krishna came in and said a lot of stupid shit. Krishna was hugely disappointing. He advocated and defended the caste system.
Well, should we start with the caste system, or should we start with the fighting the battle?
I don't want to specifically talk about Hinduism. We're talking about you're going to make sense out of religion.
Let's talk about this another day. I'm sure we can have many conversations.
Perhaps.
So basically, you've got the positive claim that what religion teaches is nonsense. We've focused that down, and you're saying the things that are exclusively taught by religion are nonsense, and the things which religion teaches, which are also taught by social science, psychology, and physics, and so on, are not nonsense.
That everybody teaches is not what religion teaches. Religion may accept what other people teach, but that doesn't make it what religion teaches.
Well, some of the things religion teaches, religion was teaching before science was teaching them.
Like?
The Surya Siddhanta, one of the Vedic scriptures, gives a description of the solar system. it's got it's like Sanskrit verses which are extremely short that will give you a way to calculate the duration of the orbits of the planets to an accuracy of 0.3%. And they give distances of these planets which can be verified by modern science within 0.3%. So like the Sirius Siddhanta has a way of calculating the movements of the stars and the planets and so on. And like one astronomer visited India maybe in the 18th century or somewhere around then, and was amazed by seeing a Vedic astrologer who was able to calculate by manipulating shells on the beach, because the calculations are done quite simply, and predict a solar eclipse. So this Western astronomer turned up to India because he wanted to view this solar eclipse or lunar eclipse or whatever. I'm forgetting all the details. So the way they calculate it is they have bejas, which means seed. So they're numbers which are inserted into the equation, which need to be adjusted as the precession of the equinoxes go on. So they have ways of adjusting these things, and every 100 years or so they need to be adjusted. But once you've got this number and it's accurately adjusted to the modern time, you can do very simple calculations to get fairly accurate predictions on the movements of the planets. Stuff that, like, to do the same calculations with modern science, for example, to calculate the orbit of Mars, you need 15 pages of digits to enter into your calculation. Whereas you can get 0.3% accuracy using the Vedic method. That's probably something you've not looked into, and if you want to debunk it, you'll probably have to do some research.
I haven't. I never heard that one before. I mean, I would grant that all of Hindu scholarship and probably whatever application is going to be enveloped within the religion. And so, if there is an advanced math, and I would expect, because this was a literate society before most, to be sure. And they do have concepts that are beyond what the Abrahamic religion has, again, to be sure.
Well, to be fair, the Abrahamic religions are basically, their philosophy almost entirely comes from the Greeks. They don't have their own internal culture and philosophy. They kind
largely,
of more or less borrowed it from the Greeks.
Largely. I mean, rabbinic
That's not very charitable.
Rabbinic Judaism borrows some from Zoroastrianism, and then Christianity reached back past Judaism and took other things from Zoroastrianism that Judaism didn't. And they blended it with Greek and Persian and Egyptian mythology, just kind of like in a blender. But I would say that Zoroastrian faith has more to do with the formation of both of those religions, right, really, than Greeks alone. Although I concede, the stories of what is it, the box, Pandora's box, and Prometheus being crucified to atone for the sins of man for having revealed to them forbidden knowledge, all of that. There's a whole lot of Christian mythology that is clearly based in Hellenism. Granted. I would have a question for you. There was a reference, if I remember correctly, because all I've read of Hinduism was in the Bhagavad Gita. But I do remember one line where Krishna claimed everything that the Christians say that Jesus claimed. Jesus never actually claimed, but Krishna did. Krishna claimed to be God in the flesh, and he claimed at one point not only that he himself personally had created the world, but the English translation that I read said not only that he created the world, but that he created the universe, and more than that. In one line, he said that he created the multiverse. Now, is that just a colorful translation, or would you say that's fair according to what you've read?
If you want to say multiverse, it is said that there's multiple universes, but it's nothing like the multiple universes which physics talk about. There's a finite number of them, and they don't solve the mathematical problems faced with fine-tuning and so on.
Okay, but it does actually refer to more than one universe?
Yeah, it is described as that there's more than one universe, yeah, and they're self-contained, like little bubbles, and they expand from Mahavishnu, which is a form of Krishna's body, and retract into them periodically.
One of the things I like to try to explain to Christians is that just like we have these 16 gospels that never made it into the Bible, that all tell these different adventures of Jesus, like where he in one of them he advocates against circumcision, and in another one he murders a child for some reason. There's all these different adventures of Jesus, but that Jesus absolutely pales by comparison to Krishna, who has volumes of adventures attributed to him.
Yeah. Well, there's one definition of God, which is quite common, but it's more explicitly articulated in the Vedic picture, which by the word Bhagavan, which means full of all good qualities. Van means full, and Bhagya means qualities in a positive sense. So that there's 6 qualities listed. I can usually only remember 5 of them when I try, but he's, full strength. He's rich, famous, intelligent, 2 others, but you get the idea. And so the idea that an argument that's it's kind of like Anselm's argument, but it's not given to prove God's existence. It's given to prove that Krishna is God and not anybody else, or that Krishna is the highest expansion of God. That if God is full of all good qualities, then the highest conception of God that is around is the closest to God. And then Jiva Goswami, who gives this argument, or it might have been Rupa Goswami, who was the 15th century Vaishnava scholar, goes on to argue that Krishna has all these qualities in the highest. And in a similar way, I was having a discussion with a Muslim on Facebook the other day, and he was asking me why I accept that, our scriptures are coming from God and so on. And I asked him the same question: why do you accept the Quran? And he said the typical thing they give about the literary sophistication of the Quran. To which I replied, okay, if literary sophistication tells us something is divine scripture, then the Bhagavatam is the highest scripture, because it's in Sanskrit, which is a more sophisticated language, and within the Sanskrit language, it's widely accepted by scholars to be highly sophisticated Sanskrit, the way it's written. Bhagavad Gita is conversational Sanskrit. It's very simple. Arjuna and Krishna are having a conversation, and they're speaking very simple Sanskrit. But the Bhagavatam,
except that it's all in rhyme.
Well, Sanskrit's a language where you can rhyme very easily. It's a very beautiful language. It's not like English. Like the words have certain endings to make the grammar work, and so it's very easy to rhyme things. And also, Krishna and Arjuna being highly intelligent people, they'll have a normal conversation and be rhyming.
Okay, I understand. Because
there's a difference between, you can rhyme in simple English and you can rhyme in sophisticated English, which is hard to follow. Okay. So the Bhagavatam is sophisticated and complex. Again, we're kind of getting off on a tangent, but I think it's interesting to talk about.
I don't mind. I mean, I'm reading the Quran right now too, and one of my many arguments against the sophistication of the Quran is that it's, all of these lines in this surah come from Mecca, except for this line, and this line, which all come from Medina. Why would there be interjected other lines that come from another town if it was written by one guy taking dictation from an angel?
Yeah.
So anybody wants to see my series, An Infidel Reads Surah, whatever, it's called Quranic Lessons for the Infidel. I'm having a great deal of fun with that series. But anyway, back to
you. Okay, so where were we? Trying to keep this on the topic of refuting your positive claim that the religions are wrong. So
yeah, which means that they first of all, it's foolish behavior in that it's a belief based on faith, and that it's incoherent because nobody can agree and nobody can show that they're right. Importantly, nobody can show that they're right.
It being based on faith, we'll come to later. That's a whole big topic all on its own. So I've pulled up my list of things where all the religions agree, and I ran it past a few Christians to make sure that, because Christians do have some weird metaphysics.
I'm sorry?
Christians do have some weird metaphysics.
Yeah.
So I tried to get something that would be agreeable among other religions. So I ran it past Christians. So I've got that they all reject natural science as being the gatekeepers of knowledge, and they accept descending knowledge as being valuable and offering truth. Hold
on a second.
I don't know. I don't know if we should just pause and talk about that one.
Yeah, because I know Christians who insist that that's not the case. Well, you just said that your Christian consensus, and
don't they accept the Bible?
I can name one who said that she knew, for example, that Noah's Ark is just a folk tale, that there has no truth in reality, that we know that this didn't really happen, that all of the religious works were written by people, and they claim to be inspired by God, and sometimes they don't. But they're always like assumed or asserted to be inspired by God, regardless whether they are or not. And then the Bible is composed of all these different books which reference other books which men have decided to edit out, that decided that these books, the book of Jasher, the book of the Wars of the Lord, and all of these others should not be in the Bible because they're not really the Word of God. Well, if they're not, then why does the Word of God refer to these other books? Why would God refer to other books that were written by mere people? And I was talking to a Christian a week or two ago who said that God needed human advisors. And I know that's not a consistent perspective, but that was his argument. So there are Christians who hold that you have to believe in science. There's some things you can believe that are not supported by science, but you're going to believe it anyway. That's what faith is. But then you get into religious extremism where you believe things that are not just not evidently true, but they're evidently not true. And now you're denying things about science. So you're rejecting science. So the people you're talking to are creationists.
Right. Well, I mean, the point I'm making is not that they say science should be rejected or science is the only way. The point I'm making is they say that alongside, they say that science isn't the only thing, that there's a such thing as knowledge coming from God or coming from some kind of divine source, which is a way of acquiring knowledge.
How?
I mean, the point I'm making is it's argued commonly, and you argue this also, that they all disagree. And I'm saying this is something they all agree on. They all agree that science isn't the only way of getting knowledge. We can also get knowledge from the descending knowledge, which is coming from a higher realm.
And
it's
yet,
revealed somehow.
Everybody agrees that we can get this descending knowledge from God. And these are people who believe in a different God than you do, and who believe in entirely different mythology than you do. That's another point
which I object to highly, and I'm frustrated that theists fall into the same faulty reasoning that my God's true and your God isn't true. I think David Wood, in his debate with, I can't remember who was debating, he made this point that
isn't David Wood the guy that pretends to talk to dead people?
I don't know. Anyway, he made a good argument. I'm quoting the argument, which is that if you say they all disagree and we just go one God further, that's Michael Shermer makes that argument. We just go one God further. So you all just reject this God, that God, and the other God. We just go one God further. And he makes this point that if we disagree who built this podium, some of us think that that David was standing on a podium at the time. Some of us think many people built the podium. Polytheism. Some people think this guy built the podium. Some guy thinks another guy built the podium, and we just go. We just reject one more podium builder and we say nobody built it. And the point he makes is when you go from 1 to 0, you go from sense to nonsense. But so which I think a good argument. But the point I like to make with it is if you say somebody built the podium, everyone who's talking about the podium builder is referring to the same person. They just might have misconceptions about what that person's like or who they are.
And this is an important point that is directly relevant to what we're talking about right now. I've many times heard the analogy that the reason that there are all these different religions is because it's like a bunch of blind men trying to describe an elephant.
Yes.
So one of them has his tail, one of them has his trunk, one of them has his ear, one of them has his leg, and they're all touching this and trying to describe what the elephant is. Well, that would imply that there was some truth to all religions. Similarly, it would also imply that none of them are the absolute truth. It would imply that they are all wrong.
No, not necessarily. If all of them have a limited number of knowledge, so you've got one blind man holding the leg saying the elephant, God, is like a tree trunk. It's true. The elephant does have a leg which has the quality of being like a tree trunk. It's not that he's wrong. It's that he doesn't have the full picture. And if he thinks he has the whole picture, then he's mistaken.
But then all of these people claim absolute truth, which implies that that's absolute and truth.
Well, somebody having a poor understanding doesn't mean that the bigger picture is wrong. It just means that person happens to have a misconception.
It does mean that it's not absolute truth.
No, it just means that it's epistemically subjective. Should we unpack that phrase?
I'm sure you have argued with it. I feel that I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here in that I almost never speak to Hindus, even though I many times hung out in the local Krishna temple. By the way, there's a 5-star restaurant here in Dallas that is for vegetarian food, and whenever people come to Dallas, and they happen to, because many atheists are vegetarian, and when I find out that I have visitors that are coming to my town and they're vegetarian, I know exactly where to take them. I take them to the Krishna temple.
Oh, right.
Because that's an excellent restaurant. The ambiance is wonderful. It's a really beautiful restaurant, and the food is good.
Nice.
Yeah, but it's a favorite hangout for atheists.
That's well, I mean, like, we have Christian friends, and if we go over to their place for dinner, we'll bring a meal and we'll offer it to Krishna, and we'll have to tell them we didn't offer it to any idols, otherwise they won't eat it. But we offer it to Krishna, and we believe that's infusing it with the spiritual energy, and we're sneaking Krishna into their hearts. So the same thing's happening to your atheist friends, that you're, without knowing it, you're actually doing a service to the Hare Krishna devotees who are trying to sneak Krishna into people's hearts through their bellies.
Well, I was protecting my kids from Christian nationalism by taking them to the Krishna temple. And
that's a good way to do it.
yeah. And one of the things that it was funny how it worked out, because my daughter had this habit way back then. This was many years ago. She had this tendency of saying, "Holy Jesus," because she was raised in Texas, right? So she's talking to a Krishna, and he's the one that has the head shaved except for the little top knot, right? Mm. And so he's explaining to her Diwali, and what a great ceremony there is, and how early it starts.
Diwali.
And how long it goes. It was what?
Diwali.
My apologies. Yeah. So he's explaining this to her, and she starts the exclamation that she is conditioned to deliver, and she catches herself in the middle of it, right? She goes, "Holy," and before she says Jesus, because she realizes where she is, she modified it and said, "Holy cow." And I'm like, you're in a Hindu temple and you said "holy cow"? Perfect. Right. And my son, they took him. They gave us a private tour of the place, which was wonderful. They show the sacrifice, all the food that they've laid out for Krishna, and they say that they're going to leave all this food for Krishna, and then whatever he doesn't eat, they will eat. Which, of course, we know Krishna is not going to eat this. He's imaginary, so all that food is still going to be there when the whole thing is done. And so my son, who was 12 at the time, said, "If you eat after other people, you might get sick. If you eat after a god, do you get healed?" I thought that's brilliant.
Wow, that's kind of the theology. There's a nice story. Radhanath Swami, who's one of the big devotees in the Hare Krishna movement, had an encounter with a Christian, and there's this dessert that devotees like to make called halava. It's 1 part semolina, 1 part butter, and 1 part sugar. He gave it to this Christian, and the Christian really liked it. He gave him the recipe. The Christian went home and made it and said, "I made it, but it wasn't the same as when you cooked it." So Radhanath Swami told him, "Oh, there's one missing ingredient that I didn't tell you. You have to offer it to God first." So the Christian did the same thing, offered it to God, and noticed the difference in the taste. And they've had that Christian was actually had an encounter, was telling Radhanath Swami, "Everyone's going to hell, everyone's going to hell," and even said Radhanath Swami is going to hell because he's not a Christian, right? And Radhanath Swami said, "Well, are you going to be in hell, in heaven?" He's like, "Yeah." "Well, I don't know if I want to be there then."
Yeah,
you're going to be.
It's a wonderful argument against heaven. Who's going to be in heaven? People like me. Who's going to be in hell? People like you. And I mean, you really need to work on your theology here. Very well.
I used to do maintenance in prison, and I had a prisoner. I'm an electrician. I was doing maintenance there, and the prisoner was telling me, "I like it in here. All my friends are here." He was happy. He was in low security. It's a holiday. Low security prison in New Zealand is a holiday park.
Okay. So we mentioned India before, and I just want to bring this up. I mean, Sri Lanka is sort of connected to India by a long chain of let's call it a geological structure in kind of an S-shaped pattern, and it exists just below the waves. And supposedly during the last ice age, all of this would have been elevated so that it was possible to walk from India to Sri Lanka. Supposedly. I'm not certain about that. I've never been there. But I know that this is the Rama's Bridge because it was built by Hanuman,
Yeah, and the monkey army, and they floated rocks and made a bridge so they could go to Lanka, fight Ravana, and get Sita back.
Yeah, and so then later, that same structure, which you can see with satellite imagery, that same structure is then attributed to Adam. It becomes Adam's Bridge, which is adapted by the Christians and then separately by the Muslims, all claiming that it fits their mythology. So again, we're talking about whether religion can be made sense of. Can it be coherent?
That comes back to epistemic subjectivity. So epistemic from epistemology, meaning proof, or how do we know, and subjective, meaning the proof is subjective rather than objective. And we get the same thing in things that are scientifically accepted, like Einstein proved the general theory of relativity in such a way that was unintelligible to the general public. And even most scientists at the time had a hard time understanding it. And when asked for proof or that they could give to the public, reporters were trying to get, give us something we can tell the public about this proof. And the scientists were saying, it's impossible. There's no way to make this comprehensible to the general public. So that's something I would call epistemically subjective. It's the ability to understand the proof for general relativity is contingent on your scientific acumen.
Let's talk for a moment about the dream of Brahma, which is cyclic. And the interesting number there is that how long does Brahma's dream last? It's 4,320,000,000 years. These are numbers that the Bhagavad Gita, this is where I'm getting this from, is before Christianity. Technically, it's before Rabbinic Judaism, because it's been contextually dated to as recent as 600 BC. Now, I'd be curious to hear what you think the date is, but contextually it refers to that period, because Krishna says things in there that seem to be referring to the Ionian Greeks and Anaximander's description of evolution, for example. That's one of the things that brings that contextual date up. But most Hindus, as I understand it, think that it's much older than that. The important point that I wanted to bring up here is how perilously close this really ancient document is to talking about the age of the earth, which is how this is often interpreted. 4,320,000,000 years is pretty close to the current consensus on the age of the earth.
Yeah. I'm not super versed in all those cosmological dates and stuff. It's not a subject that I find greatly fascinating. I'm much more interested in the technical philosophy and logical argument and so on. We accept that the Bhagavad Gita was spoken 5,000 years ago. I believe in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Mahabharata or somewhere there's references to astronomical events, and you could date it based on those. I heard that referenced recently, but I'd have to look it up to actually get the details on it. But yeah, so we accept that it's 5,000 years old. And then, of course, that Vedic culture goes back many thousands of years beyond that.
Okay, so you reject the contextual dating of, say, 600 BC.
Yeah. BCE. I don't know what that's based on. I'd be interested to know what the argument is.
Well, the only thing I know specifically that I recognized, I read that it was based contextually on things that were said and the way that they were said in language. So
Srimad Bhagavatam, for example, we have Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, which are two core scriptures. And the Bhagavatam is considered more complex, more advanced. Bhagavad Gita is more like elementary stuff. The Bhagavatam, sorry, where was it going? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Where were we?
I apologize. I was talking about the interesting thing being you mentioned that that within Hinduism that you've got measurements for the movements and the stars and everything, and now we have
So the dating that's given, the argument that Max Muller gave to date the Bhagavatam was based on the evolved development of language. But the thing with the Srimad Bhagavatam, in contrast to other Vedic literature, is the Srimad Bhagavatam is an oral tradition. So the Srimad Bhagavatam was spoken to this group of sages, and then one of those people that was present there later spoke it to this group of sages, and at some point it was written down. And interestingly enough, in the writing down, we have stories of the person who wrote it down, but it gets bizarre. But because it's an oral tradition, the dialect of Sanskrit in which it's spoken is more modern, as opposed to the other Vedas, which were handed down verbatim. So they didn't change to accommodate modern dialects of Sanskrit. So Max Muller tried to date Bhagavatam based on it being in modern Sanskrit, which can't date it for the argument I just gave, because it's spoken, so it keeps updating. It was updating for some time until it was eventually formalized into modern forms of Sanskrit. But also the problem with his date is he said at the time this is the earliest it could possibly be. He'll be, and he allowed 200 years for each stage that you would have to go through in the changes in the steps of the language. So they know based on how languages evolve that the fastest it can happen is 200 years for these sort of chunks that he was talking about. And he said this is the earliest it could possibly be, and then it was. The evidence for that is shaky, and there's so much evidence against it, and somehow that date's still accepted, even though so many scholars have rejected it. I don't know if the date you're talking about is given for that. I think if we want to talk about this further, we should probably send some messages back and forth, do some research, and talk again.
Well, what I'm getting to is that Christians very often want to claim prophecy as an evidence. And the only Hindu prophecy I'm aware of seems very obviously to have been written after the fact. And that seems to have been when they did the interpolation talking about Krishna having shown up as Buddha in order to delude the faithful atheist. And I just hated the phrase that the translation said faithful atheist, if I remember it correctly.
So Buddha was 8th century BC, was it?
I thought my understanding was that he was roughly 600 BC along with everybody else. It's a curious thing. 600 BC, you have the formation of Rabbinic Judaism. You have Zarathustra himself, so he's alive at that time. And then you have Siddhartha Gautama, basically establishing Buddhism. And there's so much going on 600 BC, all these different religions forming at the same time. And I thought it was a straight bizarre coincidence that all the major religions formed that way.
No, the Bhagavad Gita was spoken way before that, and some evidence of that can be found archaeologically. They unearthed like Vaishnava temples and even Shaivite temples, which are thousands of years old, and they unearthed deities and so on.
How old then would you say, like the Rig Veda? I very often get different dates when I try to look up how old that is. Would you agree that's the oldest scripture?
I've got to break the stereotype here and say that the theology holds that this literature is eternal. It never came into existence, but sometimes it manifests and sometimes it's unmanifest. And so the Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita.
And you don't agree that religion is nonsense, given the sentence you just spoke?
I don't see how you could. I mean, just based on logic, say that
sometimes it's non-manifest. The scripture is eternal, even when it's telling stories that hasn't happened yet.
Well, it's predicting the story. I mean, there's some elements of it which will change according to the times. It's like the science which we use in order to make a motor vehicle work. Sometimes that knowledge is manifested, and sometimes it's unmanifested. Sometimes
give an explanation. What you mean by that?
So the principles of electrodynamics, that knowledge, that is, supposing let's say the knowledge is a metaphysical thing, and it's perennial. Anytime you get an agrarian society which starts to become sophisticated and focus on exploring reality, they will discover electrodynamics and build an induction motor.
Okay.
Is that a fair statement?
All right.
So then we can say that this knowledge, these principles are there, and the fact that they can be known exists at all times. It's always true. But sometimes there's people in existence on the earth who know that, and sometimes there's not.
So we don't have any internal combustion engines from 5,000 years ago.
Well, the Vedic technology that's talked about uses more metaphysical technology to achieve the same purposes. So they don't need to destroy the environment because they can do it with using more subtle technology, which is another whole can of worms, which we could perhaps talk about.
Another can of worms. We're still not able to make sense of the thing. Okay, so I'm looking for. We understand that we're supposed to believe on faith, and I've read plenty about Krishna bitching about people in their faith. Now, you say faith doesn't mean what I say it means. And the Christians say that the faith doesn't mean what I say it means, but I can use their own scripture to show that it does. And I can use the Quranic scripture to show that it does.
So let's come back to this one point. Oh, you want to finish?
No, it's just fine. Go ahead.
So the one point that I'm trying to get through at the moment is you're saying that because it's epistemically subjective, because all these different people think they know, but they all disagree, it must be wrong. But that would be like saying...
I remember what the point was. I remember the thing that where I was headed was that Christians always want to bring up their prophecies being fulfilled as if that was evidence of their Jesus. But very often what they're claiming as prophecies can't be rationalized in any sane way as being a fulfilled prophecy. Like, when Isaiah, for example, Isaiah 7 is talking about how there's a child and he tells the king, don't worry about your Syrian and Palestinian invaders, because this woman, this unmarried maiden, is pregnant, and once by the time her child is able to choose honey over curds, then you will know that your enemies are of no threat to you. He's clearly not talking about Jesus, but somebody mistranslated unmarried maiden to virgin. And so the Christians say, always talk about Jesus. And then Matthew writes into the scripture, and Matthew is definitely accepted in canon. So this is the word of God. He's misunderstood Isaiah, but yet that's the argument that they have. Their evidence is this fulfilled prophecy, which is absolute bullshit. I'm not compelled by that. I would be much more compelled by what you were saying before about Hindu scriptures having, mathematically confirmable, testable results in astronomy, for example.
Yeah. We do have descriptions in the Vedic literature of something amounting to virgin birth. There's stories of, it gets pretty metaphysical, but basically there are what you would call supernatural claims of a similar nature. But the difference in our theology is we don't say, look, these people here are saying they witnessed something supernatural a few thousand years ago. Read this and be convinced. Once you're convinced already, then you might read that and accept it. But that's a different story. It's just like if you have a scientist who makes a bunch of claims, you're not going to accept them just because they have a bunch of letters after the name and they say they're a scientist and they say you should believe them. Once you see repeatedly, time after time, that they've made claims which have application and can be proven and so on, then when they make another claim, you might accept it without putting it through the same level of rigor because you've come to trust the person.
Do you have something that for Hinduism is what you just described that can be objective?
So there's a verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam in the 11th canto, which says, it gives an analogy to eating food. It says, just like when you're hungry and you have a good meal, Prabhupada commented, making a point from this verse, would say, you don't need any certificate to say that you've had a good meal and you're nourished. You know when you've had a good meal and you're nourished. So there's three things happen when you eat a meal. Your hunger goes away, you experience pleasure, and you receive energy. And these things you experience self-evidently. No, you don't go to any scientist or any doctor to say, oh, can you confirm for me that what I just had was actually a nourishing meal? You just accept it, but your experience proves itself to you. It's a self-evident experience. So in a similar way, someone who is practicing bhakti yoga and advancing in bhakti yoga, they experience three things simultaneously. They get their attachment to material things goes away. So it's a pretty universal, I'd even say intuitive idea that a sadhu, a religious person who's advanced, should have good qualities and shouldn't be, if they're given a donation, they shouldn't go and spend it at the liquor store or at the casino or on the latest PlayStation. they should use that money for some kind of spiritual or material welfare work. They should give it away in charity and only take what they need, because they should be self-satisfied internally. Would you agree that's kind of like what you expect from a holy man?
Well, I have much higher expectations. I have, of scientists, I expect that if you tell me that something is true, you had better be able to show me that it is true.
Well, this is a different subject.
You had better not tell me something is true when you can't show that it is true, because we have a word for unsupported assertions, and it is not truth. Unsupported assertions are called lies.
Yeah. Well, that's another topic. That's talking about the knowledge claims. I'm just talking about the qualities. Were the person to actually be absorbed in love of God, what qualities would you expect them to have, which would be consistent with that being true? Well, and I would say, like compassion, detachment from material advancement. They shouldn't be always wanting the latest thing. You buy them a new car, and then after 6 months, they're like, "Oh, I'm not happy with this car. I want the more faster car. I just upgraded my computer a whole bunch." If in 6 months,
our religious leaders have to have a fleet of private jets.
I mean, I would call that pseudo-religious leaders.
You would? There's a whole lot of people that don't understand that. So what I'm asking for is, as a representative of Hinduism at the moment, give me, and because I know that there's going to be Christians and people who are raised, my audiences, most of them were raised Christian. So give me your objectively verifiable evidence that Hinduism, because we're establishing whether it's nonsense or whether you can make sense of it. Give me your objectively verifiable evidence that Hinduism is more accurate and more truthful than Christianity or Islam.
Well, I'd like to be more general in the initial claims, because, if you're going to debate, like, is that a mountain on the horizon, or are my glasses just dirty and there's actually no mountain there? We could all be having a shared hallucination of a mountain, or there could actually be a mountain on the horizon. And we could argue back and forth. But before we figure out what kind of mountain it is, are there people living on it? What are the people like? We first need to figure out if there is a mountain. So I'm more interested in figuring out, improving the more general theistic claims. And once that's established, then moving into the detail. Because if God does exist, then all religions are right, and God does exist. They just happen to disagree about the details. Just like we could all believe there's a mountain.
I would argue the opposite, that if there is a God, then all the religions are still wrong. Because we know,
but that's a different debate. If we prove one thing, then we can move on to have that debate. But having that debate before proving,
even I've said this many, many times in my videos, even if God really exists, the world was never flooded. There was never a global flood. The Exodus never happened. The Tower of Babel never happened. These are all loosely based on actual events that inspired these stories, but were not the same stories. The flood that Noah's Ark is based on was not Noah's flood. It's very different. Right, so that there's loose basis, because they didn't have a whole lot of imagination. They based their stories, as most people do, they based their stories on prior events, the things that impressed them. The most of the Exodus was based on a fucking volcano, for example.
Well, two things. First of all, I'm not a Christian apologist, so I'd rather not defend the Bible. But the other thing is, those are separate things. So that religion could be wrong in several claims that they make, but still be right in their claim that God exists. Okay.
But as I said, even if you said if God exists, all religions would be right, which is not possible.
What I mean is, if they'd all be right about at least one thing.
And wrong about everything else.
Well, those would be separate discussions.
They would be wrong about every point at which they differ.
Well, one of them might be right on, if they all disagree, granted, they can't all be right unless there's a higher understanding which incorporates the role, just like with the elephant analogy.
Yeah, I've often said that if you get a bunch of people you're representing all the major different religions. I mean, you have the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata. Let's just say Bhagavad Gita is only a chapter of the Mahabharata. You have the Vedic scriptures, and then you have the Tanakh and the Gospels and all of their little collection added onto that, and the Kitab-i-Akdas and the Avestas of Zarathustra, and just like the Book of the Dead. I mean, like every other thing you want to put together. And there's a lot of these books that do claim to be the absolute truth and the revealed word of the one true God. And even if there's a God that exists, all these religions are going to be wrong in every other detail. So how do we tell which one is right?
So again, two things. One is I would justify the fact that they all disagree and are wrong and must therefore be wrong in various ways by calling it Chinese whispers, and also saying that when the revealed knowledge comes, when a prophet or God himself comes down and gives a particular set of teachings to a particular group of people, he'll give teachings according to the level of the people there. So, if you get a math professor, you could have the same math professor teaching to master's math students, to sophomore math students, or to 5-year-old children, and they'll give a different level of knowledge. And even in high school science, they'll teach you a bunch of stuff, and then when you get to university level science, they'll go on to say, oh, actually, a lot of that stuff we taught you is wrong. Not that it's totally wrong, it's useful, but there's a higher understanding which shows that the understanding is wrong in some sense.
You're talking about like Dalton's model of the atom or something like that?
Yeah, like models of the atom. And
okay, well, it's not completely accurate, and we know that the representation is not exactly that way. But we understand that even when we teach it at the middle school level, we understand that it has applications that work, and we don't know the totality of one model that explains everything, or that we can use in all of these mathematic applications.
So to tackle the most extreme case, which is Buddhism, which is arguably atheistic, they talk about
so many of the Buddhists pray to Buddha.
Yeah, and you get impersonalists within the Vedic, within Hinduism, and they think that Krishna became God by a process, and we can also become God by a process, and we're already God. It's just we've forgotten it. And when I pray to God, I'm really praying to myself, and you're just me in another moment, and everything's one. So they believe this kind of nonsense, but there's some truth to it, because God has an effulgence which comes off his body, which makes a kind of divine light, which is warm and fuzzy and bright and full of love. And that's a place where you can go called the Brahmajyoti. And the impersonalists, like the Buddhists and the Mayavadis, like many yogis are impersonalists, and they're trying to aspire for this. They want to stop having a self. They want to stop having a personality, and they want to merge into the divine. And
become one with everything.
Yeah, but the analogy, the way we describe that is it's like a green parrot flying into a green tree. It looks like the parrot becomes one with the tree, but then the parrot just flies out of the tree again. So you can enter this Brahmajyoti. There is an effulgence coming off of Krishna's body, which has this divine warmth and oneness experience. But that's only one aspect of the absolute. We call it the yoga ladder. So there's different levels of knowledge. When you get to the highest level, then you can understand all the lower levels. And when you're at the lower level, you might think that the level of your understanding is the absolute. But actually, when you come to a higher level, you see, oh, you were just holding the leg of the elephant and thinking that was all there was.
Okay, so my English translation of the Bhagavad Gita had at least, let's say, 8 chapters that included the words absolute truth in the name of the chapter.
Sounds like Prabhupada's Gita.
Okay, so you're saying that it's not absolute truth.
No, so we do claim to have the absolute truth. We also claim that other religions have some truth.
If you want to argue that religion is not nonsense, that there can be a coherent description, then you can present the argument that shows, or the evidence that shows, that Hinduism is correct over, say, Christianity or Islam.
Well, the point I'm making is it's a different thing. First of all, we're gonna figure out if there's a mountain there. There's no point in arguing whether people live on the mountain or not if we're not even sure if the mountain exists. So first, we need to accept that there is a divine reality before we can start to work out what the qualities are of the divine reality.
We have people who have been and are willing to die over the idea that the extraterrestrial aliens are Vulcans. And we have people who are willing and have died over the point of whether the extraterrestrial aliens are xenomorphs or whether they are the legions of, what is his name? I forget what the Scientology got in, it's Xenu, something like that, or whether they are reptiles from the Sirius star system who have adorned human guise and are now in charge of the Illuminati. We have all of these people arguing the source of these extraterrestrials, but we haven't verified that there are extraterrestrials.
But that's just saying that it's epistemically subjective. So, like, I mean, you're giving the example of aliens, but just because somebody can believe something doesn't mean that, you know, like if somebody believing something which disagrees with somebody else is not evidence that the other person is wrong. So if you have a bunch of religions all disagreeing, none of that is evidence that any of them are wrong. If
they're all claiming absolute truth, as you are, and the Christians do, and their truth is mutually exclusive such that you can't all have absolute truth.
So I've got my list here which shows that it's not all mutually exclusive.
If we get a dozen people and they're all claiming absolute truth and they all have mutually exclusive beliefs,
how is it mutually exclusive? I can show you a list of things that they all accept.
Except that the very first thing you brought up on your list, that was supposed to be the broadest, was immediately contradicted by two references that I know off the top of my head. Just within Christianity.
If there's Christians that don't accept that the Bible gives them some kind of divine knowledge, are they really Christians?
Some kind of divine knowledge. That's very different to what you said before. So they don't believe that it's the word of God. They believe that
I said it's valuable and
you also said that they must reject science. So you were strictly
No. I said they reject that natural science is the gatekeeper of knowledge. Gatekeeper means something very precise.
Okay, so now you were saying that you can get knowledge, and I'm very interested in what you think knowledge means, because for me, if you can't verify the accuracy of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you don't actually know that, because knowledge is demonstrable with measurable accuracy. You can show what you know. And if you can't, then it's just a belief.
So there's different kinds of epistemology which apply to different kinds of knowledge claim, and the epistemic demands on knowledge are of different levels depending on the consequences of accepting that knowledge. So, you know, if a doctor tells you you have cancer, take all these treatments are going to ruin your life for the next 2 years, you better be darn sure that doctor knows you have cancer. Otherwise, you're ruining your life for no good reason.
Anecdotally, I've got to tell you that I was twice given that prescription and twice refused it.
Right. That's crazy. So it's relevant. So, you know, I've heard that compared to drinking the Kool-Aid. If you just believe whatever the doctor tells you and take all the drugs they give you.
Believe me, I know people who believe exactly what they're told to believe simply because they're told to believe it. And they'll believe it as an act of will simply because they're told that they must believe it. So they will believe it. And they don't have any kind of independent thought.
So, like, if I tell you I had oats for breakfast, you're not going to send an investigator around to my house to check that I actually have oats in my house and look through the dishwasher to find a bowl that's got oats in it. You'll just believe it because the consequences of that knowledge are nothing. There's nothing at stake.
Well, the way that it was phrased by Carl Sagan was, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is not an extraordinary claim. I don't need a hell of a lot of evidence to believe that you may be lying, but as you say, it's inconsequential. So I'll just accept what you say. I don't necessarily believe it. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't matter if it's true or not. So it's an inconsequential thing. So I'm just going to accept that this is what.
So showing that God exists and you can have a loving relationship with him, there's consequences to that belief. It'll change the way you structure your life. Whereas
if it's not true, then it's just a delusion. And
the point I'm making is that epistemic demands differ depending on the consequences of the claim.
But you're saying you have absolute truth, and there's other people have a completely different theology than you, whereas you're going to their hell. And as Pascal made this.
The epistemology, like Christians are very good at giving arguments for God's existence and proving general theism. But those arguments do not prove Christianity in exclusion to other religions.
The Muslims do the same thing. And the Christians are going to the Muslim hell. And so are you. So you and the Christians are all going to the same hell, the Muslim hell.
But just because they believe I'm going to hell doesn't mean I'm going to hell. That's
Right.
just a phenomenon going on inside
They
themselves.
have a mutually exclusive truth. If you're going to argue that religion is not nonsense, then you have to be able to show that you can make sense of it. So who is going to what hell?
But this is either a fallacy of division or a fallacy of composition. I get the two mixed up. But the basic idea is showing that Hinduism disagrees with Christianity on several points. It doesn't show that they disagree on every point or even the most important points.
Or does it have to? Because I'm not making that fallacy. I'm asking you to show how Hinduism is more accurate than Christianity or Islam, because they are both overtly claiming that they are more accurate than you and that you are going to both of their hells.
We could probably spend a lot of time on this, and I think we should move on. But the point I'm making is, like with the mountain analogy, there's no point in us having an argument over whether there's people living on the mountain unless we know that there's a mountain.
All right.
So if you can show that God doesn't exist, this whole conversation becomes meaningless.
Okay.
And if I can show that God does exist, then we've got a reason to talk about the qualities of God.
If you could show that a God exists, then we would have a reason to talk about which God it is. Since nobody can do even that, then where do we go?
Well, I've made that point earlier about that misunderstanding, which of course atheists make it because they're trying to argue God doesn't exist. But theists make the same misunderstanding, which bugs me. But it's an exclusivist.
What misunderstanding are you falsely accusing me of?
So I'm talking about the analogy that David Wood gave to the podium. So if we talk about the podium builder, everyone who talks about the podium builder is talking about the same person. It's just some of them might believe Bob's the podium builder and some of them might believe that Joe's the podium builder. And they might even be talking about the same person. It's just some of them think his name's Bob and some of them think his name's Joe.
Let's not say podium builder. Let's say river digger. Okay. Because we know that doesn't have to be a river digger. But you're going to tell me that all rivers were dug by somebody. Somebody dug those rivers. Not that natural processes did it, but somebody with a shovel dug those. And you want me to...
It works for the analogy.
Yeah,
so proving that there were people that dug the river is important. And there's no point in talking about who dug the river unless you know somebody dug the river. You know, like you don't talk about a murder suspect unless you know there was a murder. The first thing police do when they're doing a criminal investigation is they work out if there was foul play or not. If there's no foul play, they don't go around looking for a suspect.
In my declaration that religion is nonsense, I'm talking about how it is incoherent. All these people have these disparate beliefs, and they're all claiming absolute truth. And you claim absolute truth just like the Hindus do, just like the Muslims do, just like the Christians do. And you can't show that your religion is any more accurate than theirs. So that makes it nonsense.
That's a fallacy of composition. That's claiming that because it's false, because some aspects of it.
You can't show that yours is any more true than anybody else's, and neither can they. None of them can. They can't show that there's a there there. They can't show that there's any substance. But beyond that, if there was a substance, you still couldn't show that which one of you was right. Even if I were to grant, for the sake of argument, that there is a God, your religions would all be wrong. And you're saying you're perfectly okay with that.
Again, that's a fallacy of division or composition. I forget which.
It is
because if all of them, let's say the river was dug by hand,
okay,
and all of them accept this, then you can't say they're all wrong because they all are right that some people dug that river.
Okay.
They could have different conceptions of who dug the river and why they did it, and they could be right or wrong about that. But that's a separate discussion. So what you're really saying is not whose God is right. If there's a God, there's a God. It's not my God or your God. If somebody created the world, then all religions are talking about that person when they say somebody created the world. But some of them have misunderstandings about God.
Requires that you're talking about one particular one over another one. That you are comparing the different religions. So when I say religion is senseless, I mean meaning incoherent. They all disagree on fundamental things. So we have, in order to make sense of religion, you have to be able to show where one is more accurate than any other. You're unable to do that.
I think this is it.
When you assume that even if we grant for the purpose of argument that there is a God, I'm willing to grant for this particular argument, let's say there is a God. Even if a God exists, all religions are still going to be wrong.
I think that this is a semantic discussion we're having, but I think it's an important one because it contains a misunderstanding. So can we substitute the word a God for conceptions of God? So if God exists, there's only one God. By definition, God is singular. And if God exists, then we can either understand him correctly or misunderstand him. So we'll call that conceptions of God. So what you're saying is, show me that your conception of God is more accurate and other conceptions of God are misconceptions.
Well, because religion implies conceptions of God. Yeah.
So that wording bugs me because it contains an exclusivism, which I reject. My last video I put out was arguing against exclusivism.
How?
Sorry?
How?
Saying this, the Hindu God, the Christian God, the Muslim God, implies inclusivism because you're automatically saying the other Christianity is 100% wrong.
And they're claiming absolute truth. So any failure in that means that they're absolutely wrong.
So that smuggles in the fallacy of composition by how it's worded. So I want to say
they shouldn't claim that they're absolutely true. They should be honest enough to say, hey, we don't have a fucking clue. We just believe this anyway. And instead of labeling all of your chapters as absolute truth, you should say, baseless speculation that we want to believe anyway.
Anyway, defending Christianity is another discussion, and
I'm not asking you
to
defend Islam. I'm asking you.
I will
of religion.
I'll go right out and say my position is that the Quran and the Bible contain errors. There's some amount of divine inspiration in there, and there's also human error in there. And the conceptions of God and the metaphysical conceptions of the absolute are inaccurate, or they're accurate, but they describe a lower level or, just one part of the absolute truth, but not the full picture. Whereas I will claim that the Vedic literature gives a full picture. And like one way I could back that up is to say,
using cow dung as medicine, just like Vedic scripture describes, is perfectly valid.
They found that there is antibacterial qualities to cow dung.
Yeah, you're quoting Sri Prabhupada now.
Well, I am, but he's quoting science when he says that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've been on this for an hour and a half, and it'd probably be a good time to cut loose. But when I say that religion is nonsense, I'm looking for something that is foolish, and we have a belief that is based on faith. We don't have a fact, and you've many times refused to present a fact.
So I was going on to my 3 qualities, quoting Bhagavatam, which are experienced by one who becomes advanced in Bhakti Yoga. And I started with giving the first claim, which is that when someone's becoming advanced in love of God, they become detached from the material world. So somebody who's situated in love of God doesn't always want the latest computer or the latest video game or the latest car. They're satisfied internally. So they're so satisfied internally that even if their body falls apart and everybody deserts them and they have no money, there's a kind of bliss in their heart that they feel, which can never be taken away no matter what happens to them. And this can be proven. There's examples of devotees leaving their body in the worst possible way, horrendous cancers.
You can prove that devotees have left their body.
You can prove, well, I mean, that's how we phrase it, because you
phrase it in a way that is not correct. You cannot prove that anyone has left their body.
That's not the point of the subject. It just happens to be included in my language. So they pass away. They pass away.
They did not prove anybody left their body ever.
That's another discussion for another time. My point here is you can show that
religion show that.
Well, there's other evidence for that can be given, but we'd be changing the subject.
What is the evidence?
I'm giving. Just let me give the evidence that I'm giving. So I'm giving one piece of evidence, which is the bliss and the detachment.
I asked you to give evidence earlier, and you said you couldn't. You made up all kinds of excuses, and then when you make a statement that we can test, they have proven that devotees have left their body. Well, no, they can't.
No, that's not the claim. My claim is My claim is when their body's falling apart as their body's dying. That's the claim. I'm just talking about, you don't have to believe that their body's going anywhere for this claim to work. The claim is that when their body dies, I'm going to word it this way because my belief is that the soul goes on, and I'm not prepared to talk about it in such a way that rejects that belief. It's not a claim I'm defending right now. Huh?
That's an alarming admission.
Well, I mean, you have beliefs too.
Yeah, but they're based on fact, and that means that they will necessarily obligately change when the facts insist that they do. When I hold a belief that I think is based on supportive evidence, and I find out that the evidence is bogus or that it is insufficient to draw that conclusion, you don't need to disprove my position. You just need to show that I don't have sufficient evidence to hold it. That's enough, and I'm done. I have instantly changed my position. Even if it's something that I wanted to believe in, I no longer believe in it.
Have you ever believed that somebody else had a headache? I
had to have 2 headaches. I've only had, in the entirety of my life, I've had 2 headaches. I've had 2 times where I've had pain in the head, so that I knew that the one time wasn't a fluke, and so that I know that headaches exist, and so I can therefore assume that other people have headaches.
Okay, but you might know somebody exists, but when somebody tells you they're having a headache, how do you prove that they're having a headache?
I don't.
Their headache is not available for scientific inspection.
That's right. And if you can't objectively confirm it, then I don't know if it's even true.
Right. So if somebody tells you they're having a headache, do you believe they're having a headache? They may well be lying.
Yep.
But my suspicion is you just believe them.
I don't always.
Not always, but there are times when you believe them.
It doesn't matter. If somebody wants to...
That's a belief.
And there's no consequence, thus no reason for them to make up the excuse.
For doctors to do their job, they need to believe that when somebody tells them they're having pain, that the person's actually having pain. Otherwise, the doctor can't do their job.
But they're not
a belief.
They're not telling the doctor that they're having a headache in the same context as they're telling me. So there are times when somebody tells me that they can't do what I need them to do because they're having a headache, in which case it very well might be a lie. That you can't do the job that I need you to do because you want to bitch that you have a headache, just like any excuse. Well, I can't come into work today because I'm sick. That may well be the case. If there's no consequence, and if in fact that this impediment to your performance actually works against you more than it does me, then I have no reason to doubt that. Do you understand? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, but it's still a belief. It's not something you can scientifically verify.
Belief. And so I don't have. If you make a claim as something that is completely subjective, and there's no way to test it, but there's also no evidence against it, and it doesn't matter one way or another, then okay, maybe you have a headache, maybe you are lying. I don't care.
Right. I'll move on to another one. This is a quote from Stephen Embar's book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. So he says there's many things we must not guard as a illusion if we are to do science or any kind of rational thinking at all. We have to... the existence of the material world, of the external world. I'm sure you believe that I'm a real person with a real consciousness and we're in a real world that actually exists, right? But
I readily confess that I believe that there are other minds that are external to me.
Okay, but where's the scientific proof for that?
Because the explanations that we have for how our senses work are so very in-depth and convoluted that if this were an illusion, that would make far less sense. And the arguments that I have recently heard that none of our senses work the way that we're told that they do because we're basically just video game characters in an illusion. Like we're Super Mario Brothers and we just hear things because we're supposed to hear them. Well, then why do we have all of these in-depth, complicated explanations for how the inner eardrum works that I can test by fucking up my inner ear so that I can no longer hear you? How is that just an illusion? Obviously, the way that your inner ear works, the way that these vibrations through these medium actually does occur. So it becomes Occam. It's a violation of Occam's razor and Hitchens' razor to assume that reality is not really real. And that's probably the prime motivation behind all of my activism and all of these religious arguments, when they always want to deny reality in some way, one way or another, because they all want to believe in make-believe. That's it. They don't want to understand the way things really are. And I do.
So my thesis here is to go after your idea that everything should have scientific evidence for it. So you gave an argument. You said basically it's internally consistent and it's parsimonious.
I don't have to have scientific evidence for everything. I have often explained that if you go back 100, 200 years ago, that most of the things we have scientific explanations for now, we didn't then. But that doesn't mean that where we used to believe that epilepsy was demonic possession, just because we didn't have a scientific explanation 200 years ago, doesn't mean that it was demonic possession 200 years ago. It was unexplained 200 years ago. That's what it was. And so when people suggested that it's demonic possession, okay, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Doesn't mean I have to believe either one.
So if you don't have to have scientific evidence for anything, then why should theism?
I didn't say that I don't have to have scientific evidence for anything. If you say that you have an explanation, then I need to be able to verify that it is correct. And if I can't verify, if nobody can verify that what you're saying is correct, it's not.
Yeah. So I was launching into some evidence that can be given for the practice of bhakti yoga and for the version of theology.
Good. I'm glad you're finally ready to answer the question I asked you an hour ago. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was launching into that, and then we went off on these tangents, and I'd like to finish this one at least, which is you're claiming that we should have evidence for any claims that want to be made.
We shouldn't say anything is truth until we can show the truth of it. That's important.
So now we're talking about epistemology, and do you believe we should hold theism to the same epistemic standards that we hold secularism to?
We're talking about being honest.
So should naturalism and secular conceptions of secular metaphysics, let's say, or naturalistic metaphysics, be held to the same standard of epistemology as theism?
Yeah,
that's a fair statement, right?
We should not be stating anything is true unless we can show the truth of it. That should be the standard rule. Yes. The truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true, not whatever we would rather pretend instead. Because we already have a word for unsupported assertions. We call those lies. You're
familiar with infinite regress problem in epistemology?
Mm-hmm.
So you said, I asked you, how do you know the world is real and I have a conscious mind and so on. And you said, it's internally consistent, it makes sense, and Occam's razor, Hitchens' razor. And in essence, that was what you said, right?
Yeah, one of the things that really irritates me on religious arguments is that we can begin by assuming that reality is real and that there are other people. And I very often have to get people to confess this up front because, as I have complained many, many times, as soon as you get into arguments of evidence with a believer, well, then suddenly they question reality itself. They question whether reality is real. They tell me that you can't even prove that you existed 2 weeks ago because all of your memories could have been falsely implanted and you might only be 2 weeks old. They resort to last Thursdayism. I hope you're familiar with the concept.
Yeah, I know the argument.
So I'm so enormously irritated by that. So
the reason this argument is relevant.
Do not question whether reality is real if we already agree at the onset that reality is real.
No, so let me frame the argument or to put it in context. We all accept that reality is real. There's
I know several people who do not.
Okay. You and me both accept that there's a real material world with real people in it.
Okay. Yes.
And based on that, we can do science and so on. My point with this argument is if we need to hold theism to the same epistemic standards as science.
Yes.
So let's look at the epistemology we use to establish that the material world is real, and see if the arguments that are given against theism aren't defeaters for science too. Because if you can give me an argument that shows that God doesn't exist, but I can use that same argument to show that this world doesn't exist and it doesn't have people in it.
We don't need to use the logical fallacy of shifting the burden of proof. I don't need to disprove the unsupported assertion. The burden of proof is always on the one making the positive claim, and positive claims require positive evidence. And what is asserted without evidence may be dismissed without evidence.
Yeah, sure, but that's
to disprove anything. You want to say that something exists, you have to show that it exists.
That's changing the subject, though. The point is, if you can give an argument that shows that God doesn't exist.
But I'm not making an argument that God doesn't exist. I don't need to. It's the unsupported assertion of impossible absurdity.
Okay. If you can give an argument,
God exists.
If you can give I get where you were going with that. If you can give an argument which defeats arguments in support of theism, then we need to see, because logic should be applied consistently, right?
Do I need to defeat an argument that can't even warrant serious consideration?
How do you know it doesn't warrant serious consideration unless you can defeat it?
Because it doesn't warrant serious consideration, so I don't need to defeat it.
Yeah, I mean, an argument is if it doesn't warrant serious consideration, then it's defeatable. I don't see how that's relevant.
If you make an assertion, a bald-faced assertion that has no basis in fact at all, I don't even need to consider it.
Let's make this specific. You repeatedly in several of your discussions ask for scientific evidence in support of theology or theological
which would exist if there was a God. Even with the arguments of metaphysics, if God ever did anything, affected any change that in the physical world, then yeah, there would be evidence of him having done that.
So that's an argument against arguments in support of theism.
Wait. You're saying that my argument that there could be evidence, if God actually did something, there would be indications that God did something, and you say that that's actually an argument against my own position?
No, well, what I'm saying is if we take that same logic and apply it to your position, it's basically like this. Any argument which is strong enough to defeat theism has unintended consequences.
I don't need an argument to defend theism. Theism needs an argument worthy of consideration.
That's another point. I mean, if you want to say there aren't good arguments in support of theism, that's a different point. But you've asked for scientific evidence for the Vaishnava theology.
Give me the reason to consider theism.
And
not to prove theism, because I don't need to prove theism.
You're saying you want scientific empirical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm showing is there's things you accept without having scientific empirical evidence for them.
I don't think that's true.
And I gave the example of this world existing, basically solipsism not being true. There's a real world with real people in it.
Yeah, but there are logical reasons to conclude the reason that I do. So you can't say that I don't have reason I do.
No, but you talked about something very precise. You talked about empirical scientific reasons.
Right. I've had this argument 10,000 fucking times. I don't know why theists are so goddamn removed from reality that this argument has to come up all the fucking time. I get so tired of it. Okay. So science works with models.
Now I've got you fired up.
Science works with science has to work with whatever model works, and they discard those things that don't work. All right. So we have this experience that it is, as David Hume himself said, it is impossible to function if we assume solipsism. If we assume that there's nobody else, no other minds except ours. There's no other way to. There's no way to.
That's a pragmatic argument.
Yes, exactly.
Does something having practical benefits show that it's true?
At one point, does truth have even a value if there's no pragmatic advantage to it? If nothing you do or say or think ever makes any sense, if it's not possible to, and he said it's not possible to exist if you don't make this assumption, well, then this is the model that works. Because it's not possible to function without it. So
probably
please do not do the thing that every other fucking theist does, which is question the reality of reality when you can't justify your belief system.
So I'm not actually questioning reality. What I'm doing is showing how your argument doesn't allow support for the existence of reality.
But
so let me give the epistemology I would give.
It does, for the reasons I've already explained. If reality exists, and we accept that we both exist, and we accept that there's an external reality beyond our minds, and God has had some effect in the past. He's done something. He's had some, whether it's a global flood or whether it's Rama's bridge or whatever the fuck it is, there's going to be some evidence that he left behind. Please tell me what it is. And then you make up the bullshit excuse that you can't even prove that you existed 2 weeks ago because it might be false memories and we might be living in the Matrix. I don't want to hear the bullshit excuse. I want to hear the rationale.
So let me build up the epistemology I would give to show that the material world exists.
45 minutes.
Sorry?
We've been an hour and 45 minutes into this, and I've had this conversation 10,000 fucking times. And when we got into the point where you begin to question reality and tell me that I can't prove that I exist, I'm not interested in the conversation anymore.
But you haven't actually shown that you have an epistemology which is supported by science. Or you've shown that it's
actually shown is that I was correct when I said the religion is nonsense. That's what you have actually shown.
I haven't gone into the evidence. I'm starting with building up epistemology before going into the evidence.
You're telling me that I don't know. You're going to give me the problem of induction again, as if that's an argument worth pursuing. Why?
You don't think epistemology is worth examining? So let me build up the epistemology I use to show that the material world exists. It's called self-evident. So when we wake up and look at the world outside, it's the perception that we get through our senses and our interactions with the world and the way our brains function tells us it's self-evidently apparent that the world exists and there's people in it. There's no other reasonable conclusion to make based on the data that comes to us through our senses and our experience of reality.
You literally can't function otherwise.
Yeah, so I'm calling it self-evident. It proves itself to us. It's like the sunshine. If the sun's shining in the sky and somebody says that they can't see the sun shining in the sky, they're either lying, they're mentally ill, or there's something wrong with their eyes.
Why do you believe that my mind exists independent from yours?
Because I have an apprehension of truth, a self-evident perception that it cannot reason, that the experience I have of interacting with you and reading the things you write and show cannot possibly be interpreted any other way reasonably. The only reasonable conclusion is that you exist and have a mind.
Then, given this agreement that we have, are we going down this channel instead of providing the evidence that there is a truth of God?
So you just made a statement that I think is really important to debunk, which is that everything should have empirical scientific proof.
Should have any. If you're claiming absolute truth and Christianity is claiming absolute truth, and they're mutually exclusive, and the Muslims are doing the same, and so are the Sikhs.
No, well, you're again making the fallacy of division. Just because they disagree about some things.
I'm not making a fallacy.
You can't say that they're mutually exclusive in their entirety.
The Christians are saying ours are the absolute truth and the Hindus are wrong. You show me how the Christians are wrong and the Christians can know that they're wrong. You give me the argument where Christians will understand that you're right. You're going to make sense of religion, which is currently senseless. And if you can't make sense of religion, then religion remains senseless.
So, yeah, I'm annoyed that you keep committing the same mistake. So the fact that different religions disagree about many things doesn't mean they disagree about everything. And they don't disagree about the most important things.
They're absolutely right. They have the absolute truth. And the Hindus are absolutely wrong and worship Satan.
Okay. I mean, do you think that people disagreeing with each other shows that none of them are right?
When they claim absolute truth, yes, because then you only need a single exception for an absolute argument. When I became an activist, it was because I got a hold of a Chick tract that was being published by not just Jack Chick, but it was also endorsed by Answers in Genesis. And one of the things that it said was that Hinduism, that all of the gods of Hinduism were actually manifestations of Satan, and that you were worshiping the Christian God unwittingly, and that you actually worship Satan. So
yeah, but they're wrong about all those things, but they're not wrong about God existing.
Doesn't matter, does it? Because we started this saying even if we were to assume that there's a God, religions would still be wrong because religion is nonsense. So you're saying that you're claiming absolute truth and they're claiming the absolute truth and they're claiming their absolute truth is that you worship Satan. You worship their devil. Do you worship their devil or are they wrong?
they're wrong about exclusivism.
Now show me how they can know that. Make sense of religion.
So, I mean, I could launch into whole problems with the Christian hermeneutics in the Bible, and Paul making things up and stuff.
Pat, I would enjoy the fuck out of that. Go ahead.
I can send you some lectures given by one.
Lectures? Do you think that the Christians of my audience are going to read your lectures?
No, but I'm saying, I mean, for your own personal interest, you might like to hear Hare Krishna digging into Christian hermeneutics.
I have delved into that a little bit. And I've been terribly amused by what I've encountered so far. I've actually quoted a couple of Krishna. And by the way, help me with this because I'm a Westerner. I don't really know. Bhakti, does that refer to Krishna belief? Or
Bhakti is a very general term. It means devotion to God, in essence. So, like, we have an inclusivist picture.
Let me rephrase the question. We have the Brahmin. We have the Shivites. We have the Vaishnavites. What denomination would you call?
Bhakti is Vaishnava. So Vaishnava is colloquially known as the Hare Krishnas. Vaishnava means worshipper of Vishnu.
Thank you.
Vishnu is a name for Krishna, for an expansion of Krishna. Krishna has many forms. And this goes back to the argument for God being full of all good qualities. Just like you get a court judge, he's got one persona when he's at work. And when he goes home, he's got another persona. So there's one story of the prime minister. It might have been Winston Churchill or one of these prime ministers. Someone was there to meet with him, and he was waiting for 2 hours or something. And eventually he got tired of waiting, and he went to see what was going on. And he could hear from inside the prime minister's son was sitting on his back and riding him around like a horse. So he's got one persona at work and another persona at home with his family. So God, being absolute, has many personalities, and he engages with different devotees, with different moods, with his different devotees. And because he's God, he doesn't have to leave one place and go somewhere else to do it. He can do them all simultaneously. So that's theology.
When I was in India, and I don't know why this reminded me of this, but when I was in India, there was the most horrific thing. I'd been so misled about what Hinduism was and what it was all about. I mean, because I grew up in Los Angeles in the late 60s and early 70s, dude. I'm really raised by a bunch of hippie people, and so I have a very different concept of Hinduism than what I encountered in India. Mm-hmm. And when I was there was a mob of Hindus that broke into a Muslim man's house, dragged him out of the house, and murdered him.
You mentioned that to me. Yeah, so
they killed him because they thought he was eating beef. And it turned out he was eating chicken, but that didn't matter. They had already killed him before they figured that out. And the strange thing was, because Indian law, because it was religiously motivated crime, it wasn't a crime at all.
That's terrible. So Prabhupada criticized that kind of thing. He talked about the Muslims and the Hindus fighting each other. And he said when they had these wars and all of them were dead, lots of them were dead, and you piled the bodies up, and they burned them because there's so many bodies, they had to burn them. That's all they could do. You couldn't tell Hindu from Muslim. It didn't matter. And this was his argument against that kind of exclusivism. Fighting over religious differences is ridiculous. So in India, if you study the history of ancient India prior to the Muslim invasion, there was complete religious tolerance. So they had Jains and Buddhists and all sorts of things, and they were not killing each other for religious reasons.
Was it complete religious tolerance if the Hindus are teaching that Buddha was actually just Krishna disguised to deceive them all?
Well, you can disagree with what somebody believes, and you can debate with them in a civil fashion without, and then you can still call that religious. By religious tolerance, I mean everyone can coexist peacefully. I'm not going to kill you because you disbelieve. I might argue with you and in favor of what I believe and against what you believe, but you can be my next door neighbor. We can have dinner at each other's houses. We can coexist peacefully. It doesn't matter. You can believe what you want.
Well, I wish we had a culture like that, because currently I found that I've lost more. Sincerely, I have lost more family and friends over who they voted for in the last election.
Yeah, so we're talking about polarization here, and polarization is good for nobody. And there's good reason to believe when the British left India, they deliberately inflamed tensions between the Hindus and the Muslims. they made it happen externally, and split up the country in such a way and said the Hindus can have this one and the Muslims can, and so they'd all fight over land territory and stuff.
So
and that caused a lot of death.
Is this where Pakistan?
Yeah, Pakistan and all that stuff. Yeah, the British made that worse. But and the Muslims, like,
just for my Western listeners, I would like them to know that it was Guru Nanak in I want to say 1400s. I may be wrong. Guru Nanak was visited by God, and God said that neither of the two great religions were the true way, and so he gave him a middle path. And what he meant by neither of the two great religions was he was talking about Hinduism and Islam. For whatever reason, Christianity didn't even get consideration.
Well, I think Christianity wasn't really on the map in India at the time.
At the time, yeah. But you would
that's why I wasn't really.
God is going to be uber galactic, and so he shouldn't be so provincial.
No. I mean, when you've got something to say to somebody, like, say it's an emergency, the house is on fire, you need to get out of the house of fire. Are you going to be like, oh, and while I'm here, let me tell you the science of the induction motor? It's like, no, you give them, like, people have a limited capacity for, people are not that interested in theological discussions. I'm sure you have friends and people that talk to you that don't really care about all these arguments. They don't want to know about it. They just want to enjoy their life in peace, right? So you get lots of people like that. So when God comes to give a message, he can't just give like the full comprehensive theology to somebody who doesn't really have an appetite for it. He can just give a very limited thing, like, here's what's relevant, this is what you need to know, and this will get you up to the next level. So the difference with our theology is we think that progression in love of God can be a gradual thing that happens over many lifetimes. And you could disagree that that's the case, but let's just look at it as being an internally consistent thing, which is not a dangerous belief to have. Because if I believe it's something that can happen gradually over many lifetimes, then if you want to be an atheist for the rest of your life, that's fine. I don't believe you're going to an eternal hell for being an atheist. Whatever the consequences of your actions are, they're for you and not for me. And if you want to learn the hard way or the easy way or whatever you think is the best route, that's for you to decide, and you should decide based on your own internal feelings, and I respect that.
Let me ask one last question, and then I'm going to have to close this up.
Right.
Okay, so I mean, I once believed in a God. Yeah. I once investigated Hinduism and came away wanting for a number of reasons. And then, of course, I had to discard a number of other religious ideas as well. And then I tried getting into transcendental meditation. I tried to experience a number of like personal experiences of astral projection or whatever. I wanted to find out whatever the truth is. And eventually I found that there's no truth in it. So you obviously, your mileage may vary.
So my experience was different.
Yeah. So tell me why you believe, and then we'll let that be the closing statement.
So I'll go through this list now. So I was making the point that, so this is the list. So just like we were talking about eating, when you eat food, you experience pleasure eating it, you get energy from the food, and your hunger goes away. 3 things happen simultaneously. And it's self-evident. Nobody has to prove it to you, and it can't be proven to you. If you don't have that experience, nobody can come and say, oh, actually, you did have a nourishing meal, and you did enjoy it, and you did get energy. It's like, no, I didn't. Nobody can argue with your experience of that. It can't be disproven. I mean, of course, you could have food that's not really food, but then you wouldn't be getting energy from it. You'd be getting malnourished, and you would experience that eventually. Like if they feed ducks nothing but rice crackers, they'll die eventually from malnourishment. And that will prove that they weren't having real healthy meals. So, and they also get, they experience devotion and they get direct experience of the Supreme Lord. So this is what someone who's advancing a love of God experiences. And we have evidence which maybe, I'm sure it won't convince you, but it's consistent with this, which is that there's many people that practice this philosophy and claim to have this experience. So, like many people, when they start chanting Hare Krishna, they find they lose interest in eating meat. Their consciousness becomes transformed or elevated, and an aversion to meat develops. They can no longer feel good about eating, enjoying something with their tongue at the expense of another living entity suffering. And we can find many holy people. You look through history at great saints. Someone who's not a pseudo spiritual leader, but a real great saint will have this quality of being detached from the material world. You can't say, oh, I'll give you $1 million if you start telling all the people in your church to buy my product. You can't buy them like that. If somebody's really advanced in love of Godhead, they won't be like that. They'll just say, no, I don't want your money. I'm happy just with a small amount of wealth, and I'm happy just telling people what I know to be true. You do find people in the world like that, which cannot be bought, which, you know, they don't want the latest PlayStation. They just want simple life, and they want to do their bhajan, their prayer and their devotion to God, and go on in that way. And you can experience this yourself. You can, you know, get a set of japa beads, start chanting Hare Krishna every day, you know, chant kirtan in the association of devotees, and read the Vedic literature. And you can also experience your developing a detachment for material things, and a kind of bliss comes into your life, which is necessary for that detachment to take place. And you get some sense of the divine, and you experience bhakti. You get a service mood. You know, when you really love somebody, you want to do something to please them. That's bhakti. You get this urge to do service. So these things can be experienced, and this is a kind of proof. So a lot of religious people will say, you know, accept it because all these people historically claim they saw something, and you have to believe it, and you'll find out when you leave your body if it was all true. I don't think that's a satisfactory claim. I think that if you're going to practice a spiritual science, you should be able to verify things as you go along.
Practice a spiritual science. Oh my brain just like, you don't throw it in reverse at 40 miles an hour. Just strip gear. Spiritual science.
So I define science as reliable methods of acquiring knowledge and achieving results.
Right, which means religion is completely out of the conversation. It's absolutely not reliable in any respect. In any respect. Period.
You'd have to show that.
You have failed to show that. You've already demonstrated my position. So I don't know how to go on with this. We've been 2 hours at this. I'm going to have to let it go.
Right.
All right. Thank you for being on.
Cool. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Fair. Please tell me in the comments section if he has established that he can make sense of religion, because I don't think he can. I don't think he did, but correct me. All right. Thank you very much, sir.
Cool. See ya.